Hello, and welcome to Loyola Marymount University. My name is Dennis Draper, and I'm the Dean of the College of Business Administration. Each year, we are fortunate to bring in a number of prominent business executives and special guest speakers to participate in our CBA lecture series. From high-ranking government officials, to leading journalists, to internationally acclaimed social entrepreneurs. All of our distinguished speakers share one common goal: to educate our students and local community on some of the biggest issues in global business today, all while reinforcing LMU's underlying mission of teaching business with ethics and social responsibility. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoy the presentation.
It is a great pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Mr. Paul Stebbins, a graduate of Georgetown University, a lifelong entrepreneur. He and his partner, Mike Casper, founded TransTech Services in New York in 1985, sold the company to World Fuel Services Corporation in 1995. He served as the chairman, chief executive officer of the World Fuel Services Corporation from 2002 to 2012, became executive chairman in January of 2012, and in May 2014 retired as chairman emeritus of the corporation. World Fuel has 107 offices in 36 countries, ranked 74 on Fortune 500 in 2003. Mr. Stebbins serves as the director of Phoenix, Arizona-based First Solar Inc., a world-leading manufacturer of thin-film solar panels. He served for many years as a member of Business Roundtable. He is currently serving in the Leadership Council of Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget's Fix the Debt campaign, and the Energy Security Leadership Council, and Florida Council of 100, a business leadership group focusing on public policy to support long-term sustainable growth in Florida. He is a member of Board of Trustees of Amigos de las Americas, a youth or leadership development program headquarters in Houston, Texas. He's also on the Board of Trustees of Silk Road Project, founded by renowned cellist and cultural innovator Yo-Yo Ma. Mr. Stebbins has written many articles in industry magazines and has given lectures frequently around the world and around the country, mostly lately about the national debt and challenges of political dysfunction. It is my great pleasure to invite Mr. Paul Stebbins to the podium and have him start.
Right behind you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's so weird when you hear those introductions, they read through all this stuff and you think, who is that person? I don't even know that person anymore, but much more relevant, I am a government major who got a job. Okay, that's the truth. Okay, so have faith, guys. When you get out, there's a job. You can get there. So this is sort of a special privilege to me. I realized as I pulled into the parking lot tonight from the airport that I've driven by this place so many times and never really focused on the university. And so, as I was getting prepared and getting introduced, I realized there's a long Jesuit tradition. Now, I am a good old-fashioned WASP from Connecticut who ended up at Georgetown with a bunch of people with like black suits and collars, and that was very confusing to me. But I learned a lot from those guys, and I'll tell you, the Jesuit education and tradition is a rich tradition, and it's actually quite relevant to what we're going to talk about tonight. So the motto at Georgetown was Utraque Unum, which is from two into one, which was faith and reason. And how do you reconcile faith and reason in a complex world? And we're going to talk about that because one of the things that the Jesuit tradition talks about is the power of building faith is around having a sense of doubt. And unless you have a sense of uncertainty, right, certitude is not to be trusted. One is always discovering truth through a series of inquiries. And we live in an age where, sort of the tyranny of certitude seems to inform our politics. It informs our business culture. It's sort of a viral thing that's taken over. And I think the tyranny of certitude in our world has reduced and diminished our ability for civil discourse in our lives. And not only as, community people or as faculty or as students, but just as citizens of this great country. So with that context, I think it's sort of appropriate to be here in the spirit of, St. Ignatius, who talked about, desolation and consolation and how we arrive at understanding truth. So who am I and why am I here? And I know some of you are here for extra credit. Good for you. I hope you get it. That's right. Because why on earth would I go hear this guy, some business dude? But anyway, I get it. It's Thursday night. Like, there's a lot of other stuff to be doing. But so I'm here mostly. So I'm an entrepreneur. I started a business when I was in my 20s. And I've had one of the great privileges of the world was to build a global business. That is just an amazing adventure. Now, to give you a little bit of context, I'm also the reason I ended up starting a business is because I had applied to and been rejected twice by business schools. So what does every reject do? You just say, okay, the heck with you guys, I'm going to start a business. But the good news on the accounting side is I do have some street cred here on the accounting world. I am married to an accountant. My wife went to the NYU Stern School of Business and got a master's in science of accounting. She's the smart one in the family. And believe me, I had heard the term material weakness long before it had anything to do with Sarbanes-Oxley. You didn't put out the garbage, you're materially weak. So anyway, I'm here mostly, though, as a citizen. So I've had the great privilege to have a business career that was global in scope. But one of the things that happened on my journey as a business person was I became involved with something called the Business Roundtable, which none of you students would pay any attention to, but it's sort of large Fortune 100 companies that in kind of a private context go to Washington to just learn about what's going on in our nation's government and what's happening. And granted, along with that is oftentimes done some business, but mostly it was an effort to get informed. There's not press, there's no staff. It was really a learning experience. But one of the people who participated in that committee is a guy named Dave Cote. Dave Cote is the chairman and chief executive officer of Honeywell Corporation. And Dave was on the commission, something called the so-called Simpson-Bowles Commission. And many of you undergrads will probably have no idea what that is and couldn't care less. But this commission on fiscal responsibility was set up by the President of the United States with a view towards trying to understand our long-term challenges as a country and the fiscal stability of our country. Now, I will tell you that, I'll tell you right up, the business guys, what I learned out of Dave Cote being on that commission is he came back and he said, you know what, guys, we act like we're leaders, right? We're supposedly leaders. We sort of fly in on the jets, we have these big meetings, and we talk at the White House and all this stuff. But I'll tell you, guess what I learned out of this whole commission? This is a really serious issue. We have absolutely screwed the next generation, and we should be ashamed of ourselves. We're not leading anything, and you know what? We're part of the problem. Wow, business guys don't like to hear that, right? We're part of the problem. We were really part of the problem, right? Because all those K Street offices that do all their lobbying for tax exemptions and all that other stuff are part of this very complex thing that involves our national trajectory of fiscal responsibility. And it's a complicated issue. But it got me so interested that I decided that I would sort of quit my job. I decided to step down as CEO, and I had done that. I love building a company, but this was an interesting issue, and it seemed very much at the core. And, I have 3 kids, too. I have a 28-year-old son and 26-year-old daughters, and what do you tell your kids as a parent? Follow your dream, take a risk, don't be scared to go out and do it. And then I think, all right, well, so what? When did I get so safe and secure as Mr. CEO? Maybe it's time to jump off that diving board and go do something more important in my life, which is my journey here. And so we're going to talk tonight about a couple of things. I had occasion through my energy security, one of those things you heard listed there. I was at a conference in New York, and I met Admiral Mullen. And Admiral Mike Mullen is one of the former members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. In fact, he led the Joint Chiefs for a while. And he's a very interesting guy. He's now retired and he lives in Annapolis. But I asked him sort of in a private moment, I said, what would you sort of rank as the greatest threats to the United States? And being in the Business Roundtable, I'd heard lots of briefings by lots of military people, cybersecurity and war in the Middle East and Russia and all sorts of stuff we'd heard. But Mike Mullen looked at me and he says, it's very easy. I'll tell you exactly what they are. And there are 4 of them, and I'll rank them. I mean, there was no dust on this guy. He knew exactly what he wanted to tell me. He said the 4 most serious threats to the future of the United States and the entire experiment are K through 12 education, the national debt, energy security, and political dysfunction. He said that will take down this country, and we aren't doing a damn thing about it. wow, that really got my attention. So I began to think about that. And so tonight what I would like to do is talk about a couple of those. We're not going to talk about all of them because we'd be here a long time. But we're going to talk about the debt part, and we're going to talk about the political dysfunction part. And they are deeply connected, for sure. Now, you might say, so what is this debt thing, and why do I even care about it? I mean, it's sort of a big bunch of numbers, and okay, I'm busy, I got to get to class, or I got to go back to my job, or all those idiots in Washington, what are they doing? I don't even understand it. Anyway, so to put in some perspective, right now the net debt of the United States is $13 trillion. That's $1 a second for 397,000 years. Right? That's a lot of dollars, man. $1 a second for 397,000 years is what our national debt is. And you'd say, okay, just a big number. Like, why do I care? It's like when you walk through Times Square and you see the number of the national debt just clicking along and doesn't really affect your life. But the thing is, it is beginning to affect our life in ways that we probably never contemplated. To put it in some historical context, the debt as a function of our GDP, meaning the debt relative to the entire size of our economy. The historical average in the United States from the very beginning of the country was about 38% debt to GDP. The highest it's ever been in the history of the country was 108% right after World War II, where we had just fought a global war. 108% was the highest it's ever been. As recently as 2007, it was 37% debt to GDP. Today it is 76% debt to GDP. And according to the Congressional Budget Office, which just came out with their recent numbers on January 25th, at the end of the next 9 years, it will be at 86% debt to GDP. And in fact, if we don't count on our Congress, I'm sure we all have a lot of faith there, if our Congress does not jump up and actually even do some of the most remote things, but if they do what almost everybody expects they will do, it won't be 86, it'll be 92. So we will be at close to 100% of debt to GDP within a decade. Right? Historical average 40, just under 40. 37% as recently as 2007. Now here's what's really sad about that number is that if you don't do anything, if we do nothing to change our trajectory, and this is to all of you back there, all you young people whose future we have really mortgaged for you, and you are allowed to start throwing tomatoes anytime. You should be really angry. If I were you, I'd be really angry. But that number doesn't stay at 92%. By the year 2030, we start pushing close to 130%, right? By the year 2050, we are pushing 200% debt to GDP. And by the year 2080, 2090, we're at 300% debt to GDP. That's if we don't change one thing. If every single law that is currently on our books in this United States just goes on their normal trajectory, that is an inevitability. That's what will happen. It's going to take action to change that trajectory. And you'd say, well, okay, 196, 72, 40, what does that mean? I mean, who cares? What's the right number, right? Well, just to put that in perspective, any of you who watched the financial crisis in Europe on the sovereign debt, Greece was 154% debt to GDP. That's what Greece was. Greece, the basket case, the country that almost went under, the thing that almost brought down all the banks. And they're nothing in terms of the global economy. We're 24% of the world's GDP. 24% of the world's GDP is on a fiscal trajectory that is financially unsound. And it's been going on for some time. And you say, well, okay, so there's a lot of debt. I mean, we're a big country. I mean, does it really matter? Is it really going to affect anything? The thing is it is a cancer. It eats at the very fabric of productivity, of wages, of car loans, of mortgages, of every single aspect of our lives as citizens. The debt is a very important part. It isn't just a big number. Now, there is an argument out there, and anybody who's read a newspaper says, but the deficits, we hear the deficits are coming down. That's really good, which is true. It is good. And we will have deficits, and the deficit is the thing that happens in every annual budget. All you finance and accounting people, you got a budget, you either met it or you didn't. Well, we're down, right now we're at $439 billion of our deficit this year, which means we're not breaking even, right? We're in the hole. And everybody's happy because about 4 or 5 years ago, that was $1.3 trillion a year is what the deficit was, annually. Annually. That was the deficit that our budget was running. And so it's come down. That's good. That's the good news. The bad news is that starting next year, it starts going right back up again because all of the stuff that was bringing it down was very short-term in nature, was very politically driven, and had nothing, not one iota, not one single thing to do with the underlying drivers of that thing that's taking us to 200% and 300% debt. because our political system is incapable of doing that. That comes a little bit later. So it is a serious issue because it eats at the fabric of the economy, the very ability to be viable and competitive in the world. Your future is very much involved with our ability to resolve these issues and find the political will to do that. So it's serious. But let's talk a little bit about what makes it up. And you say, okay, so what's the meat? Well, the meat is if you look at a federal budget in any one given year, about $3.7 trillion, that's what we're running these days. So what this is all about is the drivers of the debt are the things that are tied by law, and they are mandated every year to accelerate in their growth. There's nothing discretionary about it. You can't change your mind. You can't have a committee meeting and do anything about it. It's tied by law. And that is what the so-called entitlement programs are. And anybody who's watching the presidential races, whether you're listening to Bernie or Ted or anybody else, you're going to hear talk about entitlements. Well, what are entitlements? Entitlements are Social Security and our health benefit programs, which are Medicare and Medicaid. Social Security makes up 25% of the budget. And it is tied by law to escalate into perpetuity, right? We'll talk about a little bit about that. Medicare and Medicaid represent collectively between the two of them about 28% of the budget. And the most dangerous thing about those is those perpetual programs are growing faster than our economy. So they continue to get bigger as a part of the budget every year, right? It just continues to escalate. They are not in matched sync. They don't grow at the same pace. The healthcare costs are outpacing the economy. So right there between those two, you've got about half the problem, right? And then you get into interest, which we pay on that debt. Now, all of you know we're in a low interest rate environment, but the debt is that the interest, you got to pay it, right? That's a big part of all your finance and accounting people know that. So when you finally get down to the stuff that we think about the fighting in the newspaper, are we going to do this? Are we going to do that? Are we going to have a Head Start program? Are we going to invest in infrastructure? When you get down to that stuff, that is all being fought out in the 15% of the budget that is discretionary, because the other 16% that is discretionary is our defense budget. And that's a whole different set of complicated problems. But all the things that you think about as government services, the thing that government does, the things we fight about as a society that we should choose to do or not do, is only in the 14%. But here's the bad news. If you went back as recently as 1970, 40% of the budget was non-discretionary and 60% was discretionary. You could do whatever you want. You could have a committee meeting. You could decide. We were a rich country. We were making a lot of money. The revenues were exceeding what we were doing. We basically had balanced budgets. That was historically a political tradition that was bipartisan. Both parties were very committed to always bringing down the debt. Great book by Bill White. He's the former mayor of Houston. He's a scholar on the debt. But if you track the entire history of the debt, it was an absolute article of faith among both parties that you would always, after any time we used a lot of debt, you'd always pay it down. Now, there are arguments about what is a normal level of debt to have. You don't necessarily have to have no debt. In fact, they think it's about 60% would be the right level. But right now, if you're at 76, going to 86, going to 92, going to 100, you're nowhere near 60, and it ain't working. And every year, the things that drive it, the things that are making this get worse, are continuing to eat up the entire discretionary part of our budget. All the stuff that we as citizens get to choose about the investments in our future, you're running out of choices because it's getting eaten up increasingly by these things that are an automatic spend. That's why this is so dangerous. Then you say, well, okay, let's talk about those. So let's talk about Social Security. When Franklin Roosevelt invented Social Security, pretty smart politician, at that time, the average life expectancy in the United States was, 63. And so he made Social Security effective at the age of 65. Now, that's very clever because he figured you'd all be dead. You would never need it. So if your life expectancy was 63 and it kicked into 65, it was a pretty good program and nobody really expected it to be anything. But it was designed by its original maker to be sort of helping take care of the most vulnerable in our society in the last 5 years of their life. That was the concept behind Social Security. And in 1950, for every person that received Social Security, 16 people paid into it. By the time we got to 1960, it was 5 paying in. By the time you get to 2015, 2016, 3 to 1. And at the end of this 10 years we're talking about, it'll be 2 to 1. You'll have 2 people paying in for every person taking it out. What's even more difficult is because it ran a surplus for a while, the way the law works in Social Security, it means that when you have finally used up that surplus, you have a hard stop about the law that requires what comes in is what goes out of Social Security, which means about the year 2032, 2033, you get a 23% across the board drop in all Social Security benefits, not just for Paul Stebbins of Miami and New York, CEO executive, who probably doesn't need it, but every single one of our most vulnerable in our society will be exposed to that same 23% cut. It's mandated by law. It will happen. And that's what the CBO is telling everybody to discuss, and nobody wants to talk about it. Why? Because it's politically very difficult, and we'll get to that in a minute. But that is Social Security, and that driver is on automatic, and it is going to be insolvent in 2033. And that means anybody, and you all have, cousins, aunts, grandmothers, people, some of you in this room may be on Social Security. That is how vulnerable that program is. Medicare, which is the health safety net of our country, and has been very effective for a long time, and Medicaid. Those things are also, the hospital care component of Medicare will be bankrupt by 2030. It's well on its way. Again, a very difficult thing to have any conversation in Washington about because of the nature of its polarized thing. Nobody wants to touch the third rail of these things, but they're on automatic and they are growing. The Simpson-Bowles Commission had spent a lot of time trying to understand how we could restructure these to make them salvageable and actually protect them and make them viable for the long term. So take Social Security, for example. One of the things that the Bowles-Simpson plan said was, if you change the eligibility age of Social Security by 1 year, not 10, not 5, not 2, 1 year, and you did it 40 years from now. I mean, let's not rush anything, right? We don't want to be in a hurry. 40 years from now, you change it by 1 year of eligibility, you basically fund it for another 75 years. That's pretty amazing. Can't even have that discussion in D.C. He then said if you then changed it by another year, 15 years after that, because life expectancies are not 63 now, they're 78, right? So you want to structurally change it so it's more responsive to the larger growing population of people who are using it. So let's change the funding dynamics of it. You would fund it for another 75 years. So just by doing those two changes, and there are 121 other recommendations in the Simpson-Bowles proposal, you could make Social Security fundamentally stable for the most vulnerable in society for the foreseeable future, which seems like a very logical thing to do, except you can't get it done. The same thing with health care. They came up with an enormous amount of recommendations in Medicare and Medicaid to make those long-term and more stable. Had to do with means testing, had to do with age eligibility, all sorts of issues were in that. Lots of complexity. Nobody wants to talk about it. The next big thing is the military. So, defense. We live in a complex world. Anybody who's read a newspaper knows that it is difficult out there. And it is a very difficult decision. As citizens, we have to decide what our military commitments may or may not be around the world, whether we want any at all or some or when and under what circumstances. But the reality is what keeps it all going today is a $560 billion budget. That's every year. And that's in the discretionary part. That's one of the things we get to decide about. So the military budget is only relevant in its comparative context. If you take the next 15 largest military budgets in the world, and I include Russia and China in that, and aggregate them into one budget, it does not even aggregate to $500 billion. That's the next 15 in the world, including the two largest, what we would consider sort of, our adversaries in the old school world. So if you think about that, we spend a lot of money on it. And then the question is, so then what do you do about that? Do you keep spending it? Do we spend more of it? Do we reduce it? And this hasn't even gotten to the ethical questions and blood and treasure being spilt and for what reason, but just the cost and what it does to the budget. Interest, here's the killer. All you finance people are going to love this one. So you think about interest rates. We paid $230 billion to service the debt of the United States this last year. It was 6% of the budget in the lowest interest rate environment in the history that we've ever known. And it's, as we all know, it continues to perpetuate. But if you think about the history of interest rates, you go back to the days of Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford, where you had hyperinflation, and there you were at 17% interest rates, or you look at the historical averages that were somewhere around 10 or 11, or even if you go back to something as modest as 4 or 5%, most people would agree that it's probably likely that at some point we will get out of the 0.2, 1%, 2%, 10-year treasury bill at 2%, that is going to change, and it's going to go back to some other number. And if it goes back to even 5%, let alone something bigger than that, if it even goes back to 5%, that $230 billion that was in this year's budget, that was 6% of the budget, goes to $900 billion and becomes 11% of the budget, 12%, 15% very quickly, because it's an escalating curve, right? The interest rate gets bigger. The bigger the debt, the bigger the interest thing. So now you've got the interest growing exponentially. You've got your health safety net growing exponentially, and you've got your Social Security entitlement growing exponentially, because we won't do anything to make them more structurally sound. They just grow in cost, and they're getting increasingly unfunded. So it's eating up more and more of the budget. So all the things that we aspire as a country to invest in that represent our future are all getting shortchanged. Because when you get to the point where 100% of your budget is non-discretionary and it's eaten up by these things that are mandated by law, what are you going to do then? What's our future? What do we invest in then? There won't be any choices. So instead of having 60% of our budget in 1970, where you could choose to do the great things that this country wants to invest in, whether it's education, infrastructure, R&D, all the things that we need to be competitive in the world today and be leaders in the world today, are getting squeezed because we no longer have the budget to do that. And we won't have a conversation about it, which is very difficult. The last part, and it's the other side of this whole thing, because that's the spending side. So again, I just talked to somebody out there who's studying for a tax, where are you? Somebody, taxes, there he was. So taxes is a very interesting part of this, and again, a very political issue. But the reality of taxes is not so much rates in and of themselves. What is tough about the tax issue, and this is what Simpson-Bowles worked on in this commission, was it's not that you get the revenue in, it's that every single year on that budget, we give back in what they call, only in Washington you call something that it is not. But anyway, in Washington, what they call expenditures, what everybody in the real world calls loopholes or exemptions, but in Washington they're called expenditures because they think about it as being part of a budget payout. So it's an expenditure. Our expenditures on taxes is $1.3 trillion a year. That means that we simply give it back, right? So we've got a tax code that is 400,000 pages, lines deep and 78,000 pages thick and all that stuff. And it's convoluted and complicated. And the last time we did major tax reform was in 1986 in the Reagan years. And it is a Christmas tree of convoluted complexity with all sorts of special interests that have been developed over the years. So what Simpson-Bowles proposed was not so much that we get into a line-by-line. He said, let's just do this. Let's just get rid of all exemptions. Corporate, individual, the whole thing, and make everybody come in front of a TV camera on a congressional hearing and defend and argue to get their special deal back. Now, that was a very clever idea because a lot of that stuff, I have looked at this in some detail. There are many, many pieces of that tax code that nobody would ever stand up on a TV and ever try to defend again. So it was a guaranteed way to get rid of a whole bunch of them right there. But there are some complex ones that are very sacred to the American history, and that is things like mortgages and home mortgages. So do you deduct it or not? So maybe it's not all deductions, but the idea was let's get rid of all the deductions and lower rates. And why is that significant? Because you hear all of the political discourse about rates and the corporations and what do they pay and they're earning too much and the rich guys and the 1% and who, well, so let's put all that in some perspective. And it's not, this isn't a political statement, it's just sort of the reality of it. We pay the highest corporate tax rates in the world. And the reason we do that is because we've got this weird convoluted thing where the rates are high, but then we give it all back in exemptions. Well, why not just get rid of the exemptions and lower the rate, right? Because that's what attracts capital to the United States. That is a competitive advantage. If you're the highest corporate tax rate in the world, used to be Japan up until last year, that is not a competitive advantage for the future of our economy. So it's got significance beyond just the politics and the fighting around taxes, but the idea is why don't we think about doing it correctly, get rid of all these convoluted exemptions, clarify the tax code, simplify it, make it more competitive, and lower the rate so that you're more attractive in terms of capital. So what's happened is we've done nothing. Right? So we've done a lot of work on tax reform. Dave Cant, who was the former head of Ways and Means, now retired from that job, spent 3 years trying to take the Bowles-Simpson plan and turned it into law. And he did it in collaboration with Max Baucus, who was the head of the Senate Finance. Max Baucus said, the hell with it, I can't take it anymore, and he became ambassador to China. They gave up on trying to change it. This is in the Ways and Means Committee in the House, where it is still sitting. And we're not having that conversation. But the problem is the tax thing is complicated. And until you have a conversation about it, we continue to give back every single year $1.3 trillion in expenditures, which are loopholes, and we don't get to the real heart of the issue. When you think about where all the money comes from, there's a perception that, well, the top 1%, that famous 1% that's in every newspaper column you've read in the world, pay 24% of all the individual taxes in this country. It's not a political statement. It's just the Congressional, they'll tell you this. This is just where the money comes from. If you take the top 20% of the taxpayers in this country, they pay 70% of all the taxes. That's just the reality. And everything else is below that. So the thing is, if you're going to get to the real conversation, and you all know in your world, you live in an internet world, you live where, a world where we scan for predisposition and everybody, where are the facts? How do you get facts? And then how do you let those facts actually inform a conversation with a lot of political, why can't we have a civil conversation about difficult issues? Because to ignore it is not an option. And that's what we're doing politically. Which brings me to the more sort of complex problem with all this. Why can't we get it done? Right? And I often, I've given a lot of these talks and people say, well, in the days of Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill, he was a Democrat and a Republican. Boy, they would sit down, have a glass of whiskey and work things out, and somehow it all got done. But the world has changed a lot. We live in a highly ideologically driven governing structure. And ideology is not a substitute for governance. It is a very poor substitute for governance. And right now, when you've got ideology driving the train, and you've got a House of Representatives where, close to 60% have only been there 5 years or less, and they've come with a mandate that was ideological in nature, they didn't come to govern, you end up with paralysis. So it is no surprise that most of this country is really angry at their government because we don't have an immigration policy. We don't have an energy policy. We don't have anything that even resembles, a highway trust fund that is correct. There are lots of issues that we cannot get to because of what we've all heard as the word gridlock. But gridlock has actually got real roots. And here's the really bad news. We did it. China didn't do this. Putin didn't do it. Nobody did it to us. We did this. And it has evolved over a long period of time. And there are many, many pieces that go into this political dysfunction. The reason there's gridlock is you say, well, and believe me, as a business guy, this was the typical business mistake. Business guys come in and say, look, I'm the CEO. I want to change something in Singapore. I just change it. I'm the boss, right? So they come to Washington. They tell all those Congress people, why don't you just get in a room and fix it? Simpson Bowles did all the work for you. Let's do the right thing. Let's be fair. Let's protect the most vulnerable society. Let's push the costs out. Let's change the tax structure. Let's just do it, right? Well, we got very close. Some of you in this room may remember, because you lived it, was the grand bargain, so-called, that was going on in 2011 between the Speaker of the House then, John Boehner, and President Obama. And what killed that was ideology. John Boehner really wanted to do that deal. So did President Obama. But Obama got crucified by the left because he actually wanted to talk about entitlement reform, and John Boehner got crucified by the right because he wanted to talk about tax reform. And there's a guy named Grover Norquist who'd made everybody sign a pledge saying, we will under no circumstances whatsoever ever raise a tax. What? I mean, this is the House of Representatives. That's what you do, right? We have revenue and we have spending. So to not be able to even have a conversation about tax is not useful to the enterprise. And I don't care whether you want high taxes or low taxes. That's not the issue. But it doesn't help the civil conversation in politics if you've got people who have signed pledges who won't even come to a table because their ideology says we can't discuss it. You are in a Jesuit university. We celebrate discussion. That's what all of your professors are probably deeply committed to doing, to open your minds, to make you wonder about what could be, and to actually challenge the conventional wisdom and have an informed discourse and hopefully come to some resolution. That is what the system was set up to do by Madison and Hamilton and all those guys a long time ago. And we have abandoned it. We have really betrayed that system. Now, it didn't just happen overnight. It gets complicated because when you think about what happened in the political system, it used to be that the parties control a lot. And if the parties didn't like what you were doing, if you made Tip O'Neill angry when he was negotiating with Ronald Reagan, and they came to some compromise, and Tip O'Neill came back and told all his troops, you better show up and vote. If you didn't do what Tip O'Neill, who was the Speaker of the House, told you to do, you would be the congressman formerly known as elected. You would lose all your money, your parking space would be moved over to Anacostia, you would be on the dog catcher committee, and nobody was going to show up to campaign for you because he controlled the power. When he needed hard decisions made, regardless of where you were from in your local district, he could enforce a certain amount of regulation and informed policy, sort of, if you will, collaboration around a major issue. Well, now you have a situation where the party doesn't control the money. Because in the name of campaign finance reform, one of the unintended consequences is that you actually took a lot of that power away, which, depending on where you are, you would say that might be a good thing. Maybe the party had too much power. But what it also created when we had a Supreme Court case called Citizen United is we created complete anarchy in the system. Because now anybody could raise simply a huge amount of money and spend it any way they wanted and not necessarily disclose who they are. So what that meant is the people that used to have to go look to Tip O'Neill to get money to run their campaigns are now looking to individuals to run their campaigns, and they no longer need the leadership. So when John Boehner went to do a deal with President Obama, he could not deliver the votes because he had no power over them. He had anarchy in his caucus, highly ideologically driven. It was a complete surprise to him. It was a surprise to most of the people who had been in the House a long time. But it prevented John Boehner from actually reaching any accommodation with the president that would have put our fiscal problems on a longer-term trajectory that were more stable. And the president also got a real rude awakening when he decided to go out and negotiate and found out that the ideology on his side of the table was also not going to let him talk about entitlements. because what he got was politically blindsided, and he also couldn't get it done. So what had happened was you've got a period of time where as the political system loses its power to enforce sort of the rigor of informed debate, we don't actually observe the laws of Congress, which is what they call go to conference and have reconciliation of bills, pass a budget. Senate didn't pass a budget for 4 years before they did this most recent one. For 4 years, didn't even do it. Did not even do it. So that's very frustrating. And so you end up in a situation where you now got a system that doesn't work, and you've got people who were running in primaries, right? So think about what happened in our political landscape. There are only 12 competitive districts left in our country, congressional districts. And what happens in the rest of them is they've already been gerrymandered to be safe. So it means that if you win in the primary, you automatically win in the general election. So where's all the money being spent? In the primaries. And that's where all of the true believers are. So when you look at primary turnout, 4% of eligible voters in this country turn out in primaries. 4%. And they typically they tend to be the most ideological and the most animated. So you've got highly ideological activists who are very well funded running the primary fights that then send ideologues to a general election who then go to Congress and don't want to compromise. So it's happened over a long period of time. There are reasons why we got here. And it's not just the debt that can get fixed. Because one of the things that was so amazing working on this, you'd say, God, if you knew all this, if you actually had all this information, why would we want to mortgage our children's future? Why would we want to put them at risk? Why would we want to make them grow up in a world where we'd be 200% debt to GDP, which is what it's going to be in 50 years? That wouldn't be a really ethical thing to do. So you'd say, well, then, boy, you'd really have a duty of care to fix it. Well, how do you fix it? You need politics to fix it. Our politics are broken. The system is broken in this country. And we have no one to blame but ourselves. We are disengaged. We're not following it. And understandably, most of our country is angry. So I would say that the debt issue is certainly a very serious issue. And when you think about accounting and the ethics of accounting, what more relevant issue in the world than to be thinking about the ethics of generational theft and the accounting around how we actually do our fiscal responsibility? We have an opportunity as citizens to be involved. You as students are in a very important issue. I would say accounting is as relevant as public policy today. And it's very interesting because this dysfunction is not only mortgaging our future as you as kids, and even as us as adults, it's also putting at risk our reputation in the world. I spent most of my business career traveling all over the world. I have now 184 offices in 35 countries. I opened a lot of those offices. I've spent a lot of time in them. And the one thing that I hear everywhere in the world is, what the hell is going on in your country? How did you get so completely dysfunctional? How could the greatest political experiment, the one that we all look to as the example of what could be possible, is completely paralyzed in ideological gridlock and not getting anything done? And if you can't get it done, we are that 24% of the world's GDP, and that is a huge flywheel that drives our competitive position in the world. So the implications are not just here at home. It's not just the most vulnerable in our society who will be put at risk because we can't get our act together to have a civil discourse about these difficult issues. It's the rest of the world looking at us and saying, what on earth is going on? You're supposed to be the leaders. So now what they see is herky-jerky, incoherent policy. They see political gridlock. They see a completely dysfunctional government. And they're wondering, what does the future look like? So our duty of care as citizens to be engaged in this issue is much deeper than just, are we going to have a fight about whether taxes are, 28% or 36%, or do we repatriate corporate money and tax all those big guys? And the problem is the discourse gets so banal, right? On the left, it becomes, it's those austerity guys, you're going to throw grandma in the small fat cat CEOs, make them raise their taxes, it'll all be better. And we'll grow, right? And that's the simplicity of that argument. But so let's say you did that. Even if you tax the top 1%, the top 20%, tax them at 108%. That's the number the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, came up. If you tax them at 108%, you haven't even come close to solving this problem. So you can tax everybody 108%. Great. So they'll be giving you back money in addition to 100% of what they made. And it still doesn't solve the problem. So that's not, it's an easy. Then you get the left saying, if we just got rid of Nancy Pelosi's stupid private airplane and all those gold toilet seats and all that stupid waste and fraud and abuse, we would solve it. Well, okay. If 53 or 4% of the budget is our national health care program and our Social Security net, that's not waste, fraud, and abuse. You're not going to pick up trillions of dollars in waste, fraud, and abuse. It isn't the cost of Nancy Pelosi's private airplane. So we diminish this conversation. We turn it into these trivial, nonsensical debates that sort of demonize the other side, and nobody wants to have the conversation. And that sort of extends out through society. And most people, it's interesting, Pew Research has done a lot of work on this. They have studied very carefully with very extensive polling. Their analysis is that 72% of this country is sort of living between what they call the 30-yard lines, right? Now, maybe the person on the 30-yard line here doesn't really agree with the 30-yard line over there. But, more or less, they would still get along. They still live in the same field, the same country. But all of the power and the noise is coming in the goal zones, where the 15%ers are. They're screaming at the top of their lungs with a big megaphone and lots of money. And most of the people in the middle have just tuned out. They are frustrated, they're disgusted, government doesn't work, and they want to sort of burn it to the ground. It's an understandable instinct. But there are reasons for it, and some of them are things that we can change, and I think that is one of the things we all need to think about. I always think about, the Wizard of Oz, right? It's Dorothy looking for the Wizard of Oz, and there's some guy behind a curtain who's going to solve all the problems and give them a brain, a heart, and courage. There's no Wizard of Oz. Washington cannot fix Washington. We have to fix it out here. You have to fix it. You all have to be engaged, because the heart and the brain and the courage all come from us, right? And the thing that's so interesting about compromise, you sort of beamed at us all the time. It's the left, the right, CNN, Fox, everybody's a jerk and stupid and idiot. And what an awful way. We don't live our lives that way. I mean, is anybody married in this room? Maybe not back there, but married? Okay. Have any of you ever compromised? Have you ever compromised? I mean, I know Mr. Material Weakness has compromised. I have compromised many times. So, we compromise with our faculty, with our deans, with our neighbors, with our bosses, with our suppliers, we negotiate over whether my homework's a little late with my professor. We negotiate with teenagers. Did you clean up your room? I mean, that's what we do, right? That is life. That's reality. You don't run your life through an ideological litmus test, right? You do not check with your wife every morning to see if she's met all these ideological things and signed her no tax pledge, right? I mean, that's not how you run your marriage. Most of us don't live our normal lives. You don't not take your neighbor's kid to school because they're a Republican or a Democrat. I mean, right? You're late for school. I'm sick. Could you take my kid? You take the kid to school. That's what we do. That's what American citizens do. That's real life. And Hubert Humphrey, you back there will not remember. There's some people up here who might remember. Hubert Humphrey was an old farm, Democrat from Minnesota, and he ran for president and lost, but against Nixon in 1968. But Hubert Humphrey had a great saying. He said, Washington, D.C. is 26 square miles surrounded by reality. And, there's a lot to that. I spend way too much time now in that strange, unreal place. And people who go there, business people in particular, are just like blown away. They're like, man, could this really be how it works? And they'll go in and say, just get it done. It's not so easy to get done. It's hard. Politicians have a rule: get elected. Rule 2, see Rule 1. That's their life, right? And so they only respond to what they hear. And what they hear now is, everybody wants to hear that I can sort of have it all, right? So, and it gets into really hardball politics. The AARP spends a lot of money sending postcards to old folks' homes in Florida telling them that if those bad guys get in, they're going to screw your future and throw you into the snow. It's disingenuous, it's a lie, it is not true. And yet it makes it very difficult to have a conversation because it creates fear. And then you've got the same thing going on the other side. So both sides do it. There's no innocence. Nobody gets a free pass. Regardless of where you are in the political spectrum, I do not care. I'm not here as a partisan. I'm here as a citizen. Because ultimately, this is about advocacy. It's about governance, not advocacy. It's not about partisanship, it's about citizenship. The partisan thing has gotten really ugly. And, I'm sure you could be all forgiven for wanting to tune out, or you could be forgiven for wanting to burn it to the ground. I understand both instincts. But I also think that we have a duty of care to pay a little more attention and engage. And I don't mean that in some, moralistic way. I just mean it that you've got the greatest political experiment in the world. And I have traveled all over the world. This is an amazing place. It is such an amazing place. And we are screwing it up, man. We are really screwing it up. And the debt is a big part of it because this is the engine that drives our competitive position in the market. When the economies work, all boats rise. When you have economic confidence, it allows people to invest into infrastructure, education, arts, all the things that we would consider make us good citizens, right? It's not just about STEM. It's not just science, technology, engineering, and math. We're not creating a bunch of robots. Who are the citizens of the future? What's our civic literacy? Where's our sense of stake? Anybody seen the play Hamilton, by the way? Anybody? I highly recommend you go see it. If anybody gets to see the play Hamilton, it's amazing. So here's a play of diversity that's about the founding fathers, and it is fantastic, and it's done in hip-hop. Unbelievable. Only in America could that happen. It's an incredible thing. So anyway, so I'm here mostly as a citizen. I'm not here as a businessman. I'm not here as a corporate executive. I'm not here as an entrepreneur. I'm here as a citizen that believes that we have really screwed you. Your generation is in real trouble. And we did it to you. And I am ashamed of that. And we owe you better. And we do have a choice. And we unfortunately going to have to rely on you to engage. I mean, you are the Twitter, generation. Look, you started a revolution in Egypt. My God, help me fix the debt, will you? Because you guys have the power, the technology, the tools. But I could understand why you would be indifferent and annoyed, and it doesn't mean much to you, right? And I see it in my own kids. Like, I'm going to go save a whale because I sure can't figure out that stuff. Right? We got 2 wars, maybe a third. We're going to try another, and then we got these guys like Putin, and people are cutting off heads, and I got, the world's going to hell, and I can't get a job, and I got $120,000 in debt, and grandma's living in the basement, and so you want me to figure it out? I thought that's why I sent you guys, right? Well, those guys that we're sending back there are not doing it because they are frozen in this political paralysis, and we are not governing. We are not governing in this country. The system is broken. The President of the United States, and this is not a partisan statement. I think it's just an accurate statement that he said when he stood up in front of the State of the Union and said, our system is broken. It is broken. And we're going to see more of that brokenness throughout this year. You've already seen it in the political campaigns on both sides. You're going to see it in the Supreme Court fight. The system is broken. So my real appeal when I go out and do this is I was part of that problem. I was part of that business group that wasn't paying attention. Very happy to have some guy on K Street working on the tax exemptions and not paying any attention to the larger enterprise, the larger civic value of this great country. So shame on us. We have to get our act together. We have to be part of that. And I'm very proud to say that a lot of business guys sort of woke up and said, yeah, we're actually part of that problem. It isn't just about stock buybacks and short-term dividends and shareholder value in the short-term sense, right? It isn't just about shedding off companies to make a higher profit this quarter. The corporations in the world that I grew up in was about the civic duty to a larger social fabric. We did have a social responsibility. We do have an obligation to the fabric of society and what makes it. It should not be 1% and everybody else. That's wrong. It's morally wrong on every level. So we have a duty of care to be addressing that as business leaders, as cultural leaders. I work, as the professor mentioned, I'm on the board with Yo-Yo Ma, who runs the Silk Road Ensemble. Yo-Yo's an amazing guy, and he's very interested in what's happened to our culture. It's not just about the music, but the whole civic breakdown, because it's about civic literacy. It's about which binds us as citizens to a greater enterprise. And you've got people from the arts, you've got people from academics, you've got people from politics and business, all arriving at the same conclusion that our system is broken and is at stake, and we all have to do something about it. So my real appeal is, this is a handout. If I went through these 48, 58, whatever they are, slides, you would all be absolutely numb and angry and furious. But there's a lot of great information in there that is real and current about our current budget. You guys are accounting and finance and marketing people, and you're wondering what's going on in our government. Read a couple of these charts, and you'll know a lot about what all the fights are right now. The president just put out a budget. Read this. It'll tell you a lot about what that budget might or might not mean. The Republicans are trying to get a budget, but they're in such civil war right now, they probably won't get a budget. They're having a hard time even getting one together because they can't agree. So, but watch that very carefully. You now have the tools to look at those things. And the thing I would ask you is, what are our national priorities? What should we be investing in? And what is important? But I'll tell you one thing, if we do not fix the debt issue, if it does become 86%, 92%, 100% of debt, if the discretionary part of our budget goes to zero and you no longer have the funds to invest in our priorities as a nation because we have not had the political will to address these long-term fundamental drivers of this debt trajectory, this is the iceberg. This is the thing that sinks the ship. Because all the other things that we want to talk about, do we want to do R&D? Do we want to do education? Do we want to solve immigration? What do we want to do with investments? All that stuff, that's the deck chairs. Those are the sign of a free society that actually has the luxury to debate and actually come to some decision about those things. You won't be talking about any of them if we hit this iceberg because there's no money left. It's over. So we have a deeper responsibility to the children of our future, to the future of this experiment called the United States, which personally I think is the most remarkable thing ever in history. But we're not doing a good job. So that is my reason for being here tonight. The professor was very nice to invite me, and I appreciate all of you, even the extra credit ones, for coming. Thank you very much. And I will take questions if you have any. So. Uh-oh, we have a question. Good evening, sir. Could you identify yourself, state your name?
Mr. Stebbins, the last American president to have a balanced budget was Bill Clinton, and afterwards he characterized that as a mistake because spending more than you bring in is a way to stimulate the economy and create jobs.
Yeah.
Is there any way to get the best of both worlds, to
100%.
limit debt and yet boost the economy?
Totally agree. That's a great question, actually, because the politics of this conversation, as played out in the media, make it very polarized. There's some black and white out there. The reality is deficit spending is a very powerful generator of economic value. And all of the economists will tell you that there are times when deficit spending is a very critical part of what stimulates economic growth, and it is a critical thing to do when you go through recessions and what have you. So the near-term management of the deficit spending is actually a very good thing. I happen to agree with President Clinton on that comment. What is not good, and this is inconsistent with the history of the United States, is if you go back and look at the history of those deficits, even in the times when we had huge deficits, we always had a commitment afterwards on a bipartisan basis to pay it down. Where this began to really come undone was not under Bill Clinton, it was in 2000. And that's not a political statement. I'm not here to argue about what you thought about the president. But what happened was a bunch of things. We began to do tax cuts, and we simultaneously increased spending, particularly in the entitlements with drug care. And so we had growth in those entitlement programs that were unfunded. We did not pay for them. We did nothing to actually create revenue to pay for that. And at the same time, we cut taxes. And then we got into a couple of wars, and then we had a recession. Now, you take all that together, and those deficits exploded, not to the small couple $100 billion a year. All of a sudden, it was running regularly 1.4, 1.3, 1.1 trillion a year. And our aggregated debt went from about 6 trillion to 13 trillion. That's just the net debt. The gross debt is 18, and here's the problem. In this budget deal that just got done recently, everybody was clapping and patting themselves on the back. All these tax extenders, because we have such a dysfunctional political system, and we won't actually make a decision on whether a tax benefit should be permanent or not, we kept rolling them over every year, right? So the Congressional Budget Office would never build them into their models because they weren't part of the permanent law. They were just extended, like sort of a fake, right? Well, they finally just did one big thing, and we took a Speaker of the House to resign to even get it done because of the deficit ceiling issue. But when they did that deal and they made all these tax expenditures permanent, they added trillions to the debt. So now, instead of at the end of this decade, over the next 10 years, we've just added another 4 trillion to the debt. Right? I mean, so you're right. Deficit spending in any year. Sure. So he mentioned, you can't hear it, quantitative easing. What do you think about that? This gets political. There are those who said you should have done none. AIG should have gone bankrupt. Just kill them all. Except that all the credit default swaps in Europe would have gone. You would have blown out every central bank in Europe. So the 182 billion we put into AIG was absolutely essential to the salvation of the known financial world, because there were trillions of dollars in counterparty risk that would have blown up if we had let them go bankrupt, because the purists said, let them all fail if they're idiots. Well, that was nonsense. It was completely crazy and it was ultimately reckless. Quantitative easing was the right thing to do in a crisis, which is exactly what we did. The question is, what do you do next? Do you do it forever? The history of bipartisan traditions was that you actually would come back to the table and reduce that debt. Lyndon Johnson did it after Guns and Butter. He didn't just let it go forever. Truman did it after World War II. Both sides, Democrats, Republicans, came together and said, the long-term debt, like any business guy, when you look at your balance sheet, if you're leveraged 3,000 to 1, you're not doing very well. Look at those Chinese balance sheets, right? They're all screwed up, right? Lots of debt and no income. That doesn't work very long unless you're state-sponsored. In the real world, guys like us, you have to have some level of debt. That's the responsible thing to do. And the responsible level, somewhere between 60 and 65% long-term debt to GDP would be reasonable. But if you're at 76, going to 86, going to 92, 94, we all know what happens to companies if you keep doing that. You end up looking like the corporate version of Greece. Well, that's what we're about to do. So it's about having a government that used to be able to have the hard decisions of knowing when we all had to do that and had a rational conversation about what we would do afterwards. We don't do that anymore because we frame it ideologically, not as governance. And so now, back where I started with the Jesuits, what did I learn at Georgetown? I learned about the power of faith. This comes from doubt, not certainty. The tyranny of certitude is killing us in our politics. I absolutely know the way, and you don't, and you're the enemy, and you don't agree. That is not what built this country. So thank you very much for your question.
What can you do now to make America greater?
Invest in them, because we blew it. That's my view. You guys have got more promise and future. You are the hope, and I don't mean that in some Hallmark card way. You really are. You have technology power. You have social media power. You have tools that none of us ever had in our generation. I envy you, I admire you, and I am ashamed that we have done you such a disservice. But I would argue, please don't get cynical. Please be hopeful. Please help us solve this. There are some of us in our generation who are going to try to hand you something a little better than what is going on now. But I am extraordinarily hopeful about that. I have tremendous faith. I see it every day. I work with Yo-Yo. I've been in places. I am amazed by the great creative power of this great nation. It is an amazing experiment. And it is easy to get cynical and disheartened and discouraged. Don't. Do not. Do not let them do that to you. Have hope. It's great. Thank you very much. Wow.
Items for you.
Oh, my gosh.
For those cold days in Washington.